Can you hear me? Can the people at the back hear me? Yay. So welcome to Agile Auckland event and to AUT. Before we start, just a few housekeeping stuff. Fire exits through where there's green signs, obviously. I have no idea how to get out, but I imagine follow the rush of people. And toilets. There's toilets both upstairs, upper flight and down the flight, both behind the lifts. So hopefully you'll find them. So tonight, what we've got is, I'll just quickly go through the timing. So we're going to be talking for about an hour, so that's going to include Q&As, maybe 45 minutes with 15 minutes Q&A. After the event, there's networking outside, so we've got food, cash bar, and it's upstairs out the back there. So when you leave, don't leave without having something to eat and a chat with all the people, the wonderful people here. So the other thing I haven't mentioned is sponsors. So we would not be here if it wasn't for AUT and Jim from Searle. So this is awesome that we're able to make this a regular location now and to have such fantastic facilities. So thank you, Jim. Also, ASB Halo, who haven't got their banner here yet, and Assurity, who haven't got their banner here yet. But thank you for our sponsors. They're providing the food for us and also bring across a lot of speakers for us. So that's awesome. Thank you, guys. So when we started talking about, or I started organising this event, I started thinking about DevOps people and who I could get to talk here. And I was sitting there thinking, can I get an international speaker? Although I don't actually know any of the international speakers very well in DevOps. And I was going to fly up somebody from Wellington. And then I started thinking, this is just ridiculous. Surely we've got DevOps people who are actually practicing in Auckland. And I suddenly remembered there's my amazing colleague here who actually works with me, who is probably one of the, I really big him up because I think he's amazing and I think I've got fantastic colleagues at Freedom, but he's one of the awesome DevOps people that we have. So I'm really proud to introduce Reuben Dunn to us, and I'm really looking forward to his talk. So thanks, Reuben.
Thank you. Well, I welcome you this evening. I'm very privileged to speak amongst the Agile clan, if you will. And it's something that I've been noticing around the discussion that I've had with the Agile people around the context or the engagement between Agile and DevOps. But before I start, I'd just like to say a couple of thank yous. The organization of this, I run a meetup that's probably about this big many people, and that's really, really hard. So to do this is quite an impressive feat. So thank you for that. Thank you to Lynn and to the tech guy at the back. I know the tech guy never gets a high five, only when something goes wrong, right? When the feedback goes on or something like that. So a big thanks to them. So normally when I start, I like to start with a story. And I was like, what story could I start? Some touching story or something. And I came up with nothing. So I was just like, well, there's a lot of tension sometimes, I find, with the DevOps and the Agile people. So I thought, well, I might start with some confessions. Okay? So the first confession that I have is that I know enough Agile to be dangerous. Okay? So if I say something wrong, or don't use the right phrase, or use it incorrectly, I apologize now. Please forgive me. Don't get it in the way. Don't let it get in the way of hopefully some learnings that we can have, or lessons, as my colleague would tell me, that we can have. So even though I'm pretty dangerous at Agile, I have a Kanban board at home for my kids to do their chores. And my wife now uses it too. It's that good, right? So if you can do Agile with your kids at home, that's a pretty good starting point. The other thing is we have a lot of Agile people at Freedom, and they carry this kind of stuff around. I'm like, seriously, how many pens do you need? And what's with the fruit bursts, right? I don't think I could carry around about this, but for me, I'm all about stickers, right? So I do have some stickers today, so if you catch up with me later, I can give you some stickers, hand them out and stuff, if that's your thing, right? So the other thing is I am a great starter. So we may struggle to get out of this seminar tonight. No, just kidding. We should be able to wrap it up. But my work in progress tends to infinity, right? So I have my own personal Scrum board. I also have Done. That's my last name because that's a play on the definition of done, just to make people think. So when I used to work at my previous organization at Olympic, we had the done column, and everyone, why is it Reuben's last name? And then we could have a talk about the definition of done. So it was quite good. Now, this one I really struggle with is the term Scrum Master, all right? So now it's time for a rant, okay? So we've just started, but here is the rant, okay? Master, slave, okay? So I have a Scrum Master, and in distributed computing and computing in general, there's a lot of talk about this master and slave relationship, okay? I was challenged by a speaker at Yale, from Uber, who reminded me slavery is not one of the better outcomes of our existence, right? And then he said, how do you promote a slave to a master? How does that physically work? They're a slave. The slaves don't become masters. It's just impossible. So there's normally a new slave, but then a new master will come in. But even if the slave gets promoted, the slave normally knows that it's pretty stink to be a slave, so he probably lets all the other slaves free. So it doesn't really work. So if you have master-slave diagrams, analogies at your work, leader-follower, teacher-student perhaps, blue-green, there's plenty of other words. And I think it's about time we maybe change Scrum Master, but that's just my opinion anyway. Okay, so that's the end of my rant. The other thing is that if you have a cross-functional team and there are no operational people involved in that cross-functional team, by definition, by me, it's not a cross-functional team. How many people have ops contributors on their Agile teams? Well, that's impressive. That's good. So we could all learn from these people. Okay, and I do believe Agile is a foundational element for DevOps, and we'll go into that. The other thing I'd like to just to acknowledge, as some of my colleagues in the front row, I'm probably not the smartest person in the room, okay? So I rely on you sometimes. If I can't answer a question, or if I get something right, or I'm factually incorrect, no mai hara mai, just put your hand up and let me know. Okay, that's really helpful. All right. So the other thing, this is just a plug. I'm a lead developer, lead organizer for the DevOps Days New Zealand conference. We're looking to host one later this year. It's a fantastic conference. They're built around local, so we tend to focus inwards in our communities as opposed to get guest speakers in. Sometimes we do get some people in, but that's just to drive the community involvement. If you want more information, just follow that Twitter handle down the bottom there, and we'll keep you up to date. All right, DevOps definition. Here we go. This is what you probably paid for, because everyone wants to know the definition of DevOps. I have just concluded that you could subtract DevOps and do a regex, if you will, not have two problems, with magic, and it would still sound theoretically correct, right? You just replace it, and it's magic. And Arthur C. Clarke, I think it is, his new technology thing is indistinguishable. Thank you, indistinguishable. See, that's how it's really good. Indistinguishable from magic. And this is the thing with DevOps, is a lot of people see it as magic. What else do we see? Well, a while ago, there's a couple of guys, really smart guys, Damon Edwards. They came up with this kind of acronym for it. So it's CLAMS or CAMS, depending if you're a lean person or not. But basically, it divides the approach of where we have an effect of DevOps, right? And that's culture, lean, automation, measure, and sharing, right? And the aspects around that is that if you just are in one element, you tend not to be DevOps, right? So we see what we tend to see in the DevOps is a lot of automation. So we'll see like what we call a bottom-up approach, and the automation is going. But for automation to take hold in your organization, you also have to have an appetite in your culture to do that, because you'll run into a lot of barriers. Okay, we can also say that DevOps has business value. Shareholders like that one. Continuous improvement, we're getting better at what we do, which is interesting because it seems we continually make the same mistakes. And this one's a big one for me, driven by empathy. So typically, we would tend to have interdepartmental wars, if you will. But now it's more of understanding that, hey, maybe the prime directive is actually correct. And if is it the prime directive? Is that the one? Yeah, prime directive, thank you. If that is correct, but we act in different ways sometimes. So empathy is a key stakeholder. So basically what I'm saying is value-driven magic with feelings, which is not helpful, okay? So if we look and step back away from the implementation, I've always believed at the implementation level there'd be dragons. We get into all sorts of religious wars. What are we saying at a declarative level of the value of what DevOps will give us, right? And so we can say that we're highly performing, that we're continuously improving, and perhaps we're even happy, heaven forbid. There has been research apparently, and this is just really funny that they had to do the research, but there's some aspects around, I think what is socio-techno-systems, right? This concept, now wait for it, that if you have a happy team, makes a better product, right? Genius. Oh, I tell you, whoa. They paid that person. I'm like, can I get on that bandwagon? So they did some experiments, but they found that this was even true with coal miners in careers and in professions that are quite dangerous. But if they were happy, they produced more stuff. Interesting. Wow. Unbelievable. So that's a declarative state. So just to give you some idea of where a strategic direction that I'm going with the DevOps at Freedom is we're talking about an accelerated means of learning, right? And so there's a lot of talk going around the fact that everyone has access to all the resources, and no, I don't mean people. They have access to all the power, all the knowledge, right, and all the software that they need, right? So the critical factor as a competitive advantage is being able to apply all of that to derive business value. And so that's one of the things. And as an aspect of that, one of the things I'm promoting is learning to do the work, valuing learning to do the work over doing the work, right? And there is a subtle difference, but a really important difference, especially if we're talking a lot about technical people. As soon as we say learning, we're learning the new framework, the new language. It's tangible stuff. It's not learning how I can have a better outcome for my team in the way that we get work done. So maybe not turning up at 11 o'clock is a good idea, right? But we don't learn it, and we'll just continue turning up at 11 o'clock, and hey, what do you know? We miss our targets. And then the other one, I'm a big Patrick Lencioni fan. That's why I started with my confessions. He has this concept around organizational health, right? So he breaks it down into strategy, the stuff that we're doing now, but also organizational health, right? And as you probably can tell, there's a lot of dysfunction in a lot of organizations, maybe. Let me know if no one's got some dysfunctional in their organization, because I'll come work for you. Sorry. No. But those are the kind of things. But so those kind of things, we've spoken declaratively, and when I speak with Agile people, the tendency is always, that's what Agile does. That's what we're supposed to do. And so we're in this kind of friend or foe kind of like checking each other out, like, hey man, you're stealing my lunch, this kind of engagement, which is kind of not helpful, right? But to call it out is really helpful. So the other thing with DevOps is the implementation, if you will, is a product or a factor of your organization, right? And this is where we get into problems with a canonical example of DevOps. It's because everyone is different, right? And what works in one organization really is there's a tendency to not work in another organization. And I'll touch on a bit of that later on in the talk. So if we're talking about, if we've got Maybe is it an agile approach or a DevOps approach? None of them could be wrong, right? But it may affect how long we achieve our target condition, right? And so sometimes if we were to decompose that declarative endpoint of where we want it to be, we might say, oh, we can do it. Agile works for us here. In this organization, in another organization, it might be Agile DevOps, and in another, it might just be the DevOps, right? But because DevOps is a foundation for Agile, you're going to get Agile for free anyway, but just my 2 cents anyway, right? Okay, and then we might have some casualties on the side of that as well, right? So the Agile perspective. So this is where I might get a little racy, right? And shoot some barbs across the bow of one's yacht or boat, if you will. Okay? So what's good about Agile? There was an acknowledgement that we needed to change the way that we make software, right? And it's a really important fact that we need to change the way that we made software. And I would argue that if we went back, so we kind of get, that we become casualties of the gradual change. The frog in the boiling water, if you will, right? Not in the blender, in the boiling water, okay? So, and it turns up slowly, nothing's changed, right? But fundamentally, so we think that this is not different. But if we went back to the old way, it would be pretty obvious that this would be the wrong way to build software, right? So the other thing is that we are championing a change in mindset, right? Which is, again, another DevOps kind of a thing. But what I've found, and so these are my opinions. Happy to talk about this, especially if you've got different opinions. But we seem to have what I would tend to call an oversimplification, and we've led into some variances, right? So automatically now we say Agile is Scrum. So if you know what a triple equals in code, basically means it's the same thing, right? So we say Agile is Scrum. And then people are like, well, Scrum's not only Agile. And then we start getting into this religious war, of which has no value. The other thing is that we get the Scrumathal kind of a thing, right? Where it's kind of like, oh, let's do it like half, and let's just do like that half. And, and some of that, what I find really interesting is how that happens, right? And the tendency, from what I have observed, is that at the senior, maybe the more exec level, there's a tendency, I see a tendency to say, hey, you Agile people, you go over and you play in your Agile little playground, and we'll still over here with our Gantt charts and our budgets and our thing, and then we've got this friction that comes in. And so we get stuff like Scrumathal. When I was working at Olympic Software, the other thing that I noticed is that we were working with Woolworths in Australia, a big company, and while their development teams were Agile, their resourcing and finance teams were not. So there was a lot of hard work there, and I've decided that corporate boundaries, they trump Agile, right? Because if you've got a customer paying for something, and you want to have a retrospective about how you messed up the code and made it late, that's a really hard conversation to have, right? Because the customer's likely to say, can I get a refund for that? And that's really not helpful. The other thing that I've noticed is the scope of influence. So we talk about we need to change the way that software is being developed, but I feel that we missed half the problem, right? Software needs to run in order to be used, right? And so what I see traditionally in Agile, and what it tends to be presented to me, which could be wrong, is that we tend to be segregated from those that run the code, those that look after the code, verify that it's even working, and the predictions that you made when you did your story estimate planning, poker, card, whatever thing that happens that you do, and we say we're going to put a new open the door feature in, actually gets used. Because we're only ever making predictions when we create new features in our software. But then, how do we know that that prediction was true or false? Right? And so, as I said before, there's sort of the business and the exec level, so we got a PO. I do think the POs are looked upon sadly by executive teams. They're like, oh, you're part of the Agile team, like kind of like that. Kind of, I might be wrong. Any C-level people in the house? No? Executive people? No? Oh, Zach. Startup? Yeah. Startup. Exec, yeah. You should have like a suit and stuff. Sorry. Okay. But also from operations, right? And so we get into this thing where we kind of like maybe feel like the meat in the sandwich, perhaps. And what I find is that we're an incomplete inverse Taylor maneuver. So just to touch on what I would reference an inverse Taylor maneuver. So we know there's this fella called someone Taylor, Richard Taylor, I think his name is, and he had a brainwave, and so we called him a management scientist. And I'm like, what even is a management scientist? But let's just say that was a real thing. And he said, well, if we put all the people that do stuff here, like for likes, and then just move them along, it'll be really cool, right? And that tends to work well in a simple or complicated domain. Manufacturing, generic laboring of sorts, that works well. Where it tends to fall apart is in the complex and the chaotic domain, which is where we write software, right? We are in a complex domain. So a cross-functional team is, in effect, an inverse Taylor maneuver. We're saying, hey, I need the product knowledge, I need the business analyst, I need a couple of developers, because they're really important, I need some testers, because they're even more important, and I need all these other people. So we've brought these people together. And this is where I feel that Agile has kind of not, it could have gone given that we are looking for a change in mindset, what I find is we just propel a sense of role. So we're not bringing a change in mindset of we need all of this knowledge to build fantastic software. We're just saying we need a tester, and then when there's testing stuff, the tester gets the tester stuff, and the developers do the developing, and so on and so on. So therefore, it makes it really hard for a developer to say, hey, I really think you could use this feature. That would be a really cool feature. One of the things that we struggle a lot with in a lot of organizations that I've worked with in the past is actually having developers use the software. Developers use the software. They stop thinking in just a technical sense, and they move to a business sense of what makes that experience better. So what we've done is we've joined all these people together, which is very good, but we've sort of instilled maybe a belief, failed to change the mindset, in my opinion, and so people are just acting on roles. And the other thing is, what is done? Right? Who has a development swimming lane or whatever you call it on your Scrum board or Kanban board? Who has a development one? No one? Okay, thank you. Okay, who has a test area? Okay. Who has acceptance? Whoa. Who has production? Oh, production, yes. Who has validation of production? Oh, look at these two people. Clap for you, sir and ma'am. Right? Typically in the organization, what is done? It's like, well, it might not even be acceptance. Right? It's just like done. So an example that I saw that really spoke eloquently to me was there was once the finished development had gone into production, they had a validation lane. And they would know that they needed to architect for some sort of validation, whether that be instrumenting their code, whether that be monitoring that code. And that was not from a technical perspective. That was not how much RAM am I using, how much CPU cycles am I chewing up. This was stuff like average transaction value. user logons, feature usage, that kind of stuff. And when that information came back to validate the prediction that we made that this would deliver better value, that's when they were done, and that's when they had the party. And they also invited the operations people in on the party too. Right? So, some of the things I observe in our Agile teams, and these are just observations, and I'm not casting judgment on Agile, right? I think this is a factor which I'll allude to shortly of some simplification of the problem domain. Okay? The Scrum coach, I'm going to call him Scrum coach or her Scrum coach from now on because we don't like the term master, seems to be, in my experience, the only person that can manage a stand-up. And so if that's, you're sitting there, three things, everyone have three things for their stand-up? Anyone not do a stand-up? Oh, everyone does a stand-up. Oh, the guy at the back. So you can not answer this, but this is pretty cool. So you've done a stand-up, and we're sitting there, and the three things typically, right? What did we do yesterday? What did we do today? What's blockers? Blockers. Okay, so those are the things. And we get to the development people. And then they're like, well, I wrote this class, and then I was trying to do this pattern. I thought it was a strategy pattern, but then I had to back out of that. And everyone else is like, oh, where's my phone? Right? Everyone's like this. And then everyone else is thinking, oh, seriously? We don't need to go in that much detail. That's what that's what I'm thinking. Maybe everyone else is not thinking that, but anyway. Or someone might share about how they washed their dog yesterday because that was something they did, not related to work. Because I washed my dog. Like, whoa. Okay, but we get in this role set, right? That's what the Scrum coach does, right? They police the stand-up. And the Scrum coaches are like, no, it shouldn't be us. I know, because I've talked to her some. And then I also get the impression, and this could be, so if we had our swimming lanes and we had our Scrum board, and we, like the line that came down there as it passes from dev to test, and we put a microscope on it, there's the word done. Because I have seen teams, they go, boosh, I am now done. I think I'll go take a rest. I have heard teams that meet at the stand-up, look at the board, identify the constraint in their team. We have a testing constraint. There's a lot of work to be tested. Not the testers have to do it, there is a lot of testing work to be done. And I've heard of development contributors stopping their development work, relieving the constraint, even though it's not their primary role to do it. Right? And that is a way better outcome than I said. I think I just went a bit too far. The other thing is around about ritual fatigue, right? We have this conversation all the time. Oh, we need another one of those. I'm a developer. I just want to develop. That's what I get paid to do. Not to think about what I'm developing, just to turn out code. Right? And that's not a judgment on most developers. This is the kind of conversations we have. Because if the feeling is I'm not writing enough code or I'm getting interrupted, that's a poor rationalization, and I'll touch on that later on. But these are the kind of outcomes that we have, right? But what would it look like if we had behaviors where everyone in the stand-up held everyone else to account and were free to do that? To me, that is a mindset change, right? The three things, anyone, I can't remember the exact tool, but we have a phrase called protocol check. Anyone use protocol check, right? So one of the things that we say is like, for behaviors, why don't people just do this? I keep telling them, but they don't listen. If you say that, that's an inverse DevOps maneuver. You need to back it up. People say what is either being modeled or what the system incentivized for, right? So typically most people do not know how to say, that's too much. Well, first of all, I feel that's too much information. We don't need that. And there are really a lot of tools around that help us do that. And one of them is protocol check. So if someone's talking about the class and they're like, oh, blah, class and foo and bar, all someone needs to say is protocol check. And then everyone else can then go, yeah, I agree. And then we move past that. right? We have now given them a tool to change their mindset, not right? As opposed to rely on one person to be the police. Okay? And this was the other thing that I touched on briefly before about how teams can work together, identify a constraint within their team, and work together to relieve it, right? This is really powerful stuff. And the other, out of that, I get this concept that Agile becomes now this higher order energy state. And what I mean by that is we're having to prop it up, right? We have to, like, defend, if you will. So some examples with that is like, we wanted to get here, but we're kind of here, and then it's like, it's just taking more baby steps to get there, right? And there's a continual sense that maybe it feels like it should be better than what it is now. And we've been doing this for a while. The other aspect is to prove the value, right? And so this comes when, over a period of time, you might get some feedback that we have too many rituals, right? Feedback that we have too many defects or our reliability is poor, right? And so we have this concept that we value when we know what our declarative state is and what the value that Agile intrinsically we feel provides. But we're having to sort of put that show on for everyone else, which I find is extremely frustrating. I don't know, I put a show on for my kids every day, and it's really, really hard and frustrating. And at the bottom there, it's probably unsustainable, right? And that's the worst thing when you have someone that truly believes in something and they are exhausted from it. So what is the DevOps perspective then? So first of all, we welcome the operations people. We have an understanding, and probably you could argue that it came from DevOps. You'll meet one DevOps. I'm a developer, DevOps kind of guy, but then if you rewind about like 7 years and then like forever that my brain can remember, I was an operations guy. So I do have an affinity to both sides, right? But it's an acknowledgement that in order that we need to be able to run our software and maintain our software, not just develop it and create it. We have a concept of the reliability of the code. Is anyone in their teams that they work with doing any instrumentation in their code that they're working with now? 2 people. It's very helpful. I think it's very helpful, right? And there's millions, that's a slight exaggeration. There's a few tools that can help us do that, right? But there's also cultural barriers that we have to go. So typically for a lot of people, it's quite common to instrument their code. So that is during their code and their routines of their code and in their lines of their code, they may add a counter or a gauge and then pop that up somewhere for it to be consumed by some time series reporting system, right? Fundamentally, when you talk to development people, they will be like really super concerned that it will bring the system down, right? So there are some constraints around that. But we need to have visibility of how reliable our code is. So in DevOps, we have these concepts of top-down and bottom-up, which I feel is a little bit different in the Agile one. So the bottom-up ones typically mean we sort of start with automation, and we can show some value from the automation. The top-down typically means that some C-levels read some article in some fancy pants magazine and said, we should do the DevOps, right? The other aspects of that is if there's an appetite for change. One of the things that I thought was quite clever was this concept of version-controlled culture, right? That your culture can rev at the same pace as your code. Now, that might not be a good thing for everyone, but typically the perception that we have on culture is it's set in stone and nothing's going to change it, right? So the other thing is that an understanding that when we build features, that we're only ever making predictions. So I like to troll people in these things, because there are some people that are like dead certain for sure that this aspect of code or feature that they want is going to be used. Now, I've worked on one product. I can't tell because there's a guy over there that I used to work with, so he'll tell me off. But I worked on one product, and we just did not understand why they wanted this feature. Could not understand. So we were quite happy when they were logging into the Facebook account of said and saying, this is rubbish. So we're like, yes, right? So all the features that we ever do are only a prediction. And if they're only a prediction, then we need to know if we were right or wrong, right? So we need to be able to validate those perceptions. The other thing is that we embrace a scientific method of learning and building software, right? So if we look at, someone's going to help me, that Welsh, Cynefin? Cynefin, is that how you put Cynefin? Thank you. So we're in the complex domain, right? So complex domain is probe, sense, respond, right? Because it's non-deterministic, right? To be able to say, I think this is going to happen, is interesting, anyway, just for me, okay? And then I talk about this macro inverse Taylor, and the people at work are really tired of me talking about inverse Taylor and inverse Conway and stuff like this, but I say it whenever I can. But the concept of having someone in your organization that is across the business aspects of the organization and the technical aspects of the organization, and they are one person. And you could have a conversation about them, and they will know the inside out of how that business runs. They will know what their GP is, they'll know what their strategy is, they will know what their users want. And at the same time, they will tell you the technical implementation of how they get that. So if you have a tester or developer, sometimes we have these religious wars and battles between frameworks and how the testers should work and how we should work together as a team without the fundamental guidance of where the business needs to be heading. Right? But there are some risks, and we do have some anti-patterns creeping in. So we do tend to have implementation variances, and I touched on this before, right? What works at Netflix, Etsy, or Spotify may not work for you. Just a warning, right? And that is because they are not you, right? So I know, is it Adam Cockcroft? Talks about this a lot, where people complain that Netflix take all the engineers, and people complain that they took the Netflix microservices framework, approach, architecture, whatever you want to call it, and now it's just a really big mess, or even worse, a distributed monolith, because of a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were as an organization. You know, there's a couple of people whose names escape me that are very, very clever in software development and architecture, and they talk about being this tall to ride certain architectures across your organization. But people don't even think that. They just go, they like the outcome, they've seen an implementation, well, let's put it on us. And then are horrified at the outcome. We can become abstract in how we talk. We can refer to it as magic, and then as a condiment that you store in the pantry. So I did have a conversation with some resellers from a logging framework that Splunk, and they were like, you just get your logging and then sprinkle some DevOps on it. And I'm like, what does that even mean? So now when I have conversations, so we were having some roadmaps at Freedom about where we're going, and we were like putting stuff up on, stickies, your agile people, like what my friend had up on there. He's like, every time I see DevOps, I need to ask, what does that mean, right? Because a lot of the times it's abstract. Sometimes it's build deploy, sometimes it's everything, sometimes it's nothing, sometimes it's agile. Like, oh my gosh, what is it? So we get an abstract. But the sprinkling the DevOps, that's always a favorite, right? It's just like, it's a real easy fix. Okay, but the other thing is that some of the anti-patterns is that we fail to change behaviors, right? We fail to change those mindsets. And the worst thing is that we have a loss of empathy, which is very unfortunate. Because as soon as you have a loss of empathy, your credibility really goes out the water, right? And one of the things, and that's probably the hardest aspect of DevOps that I have found, is the empathy. If you were to ask my wife if I had an empathetic bone in my body, she would say, hell no. She was like, what? There's empathy? Well, how come you're doing it? Right? It's kind of, I have like a different character at home. What do you call that? A split personality or something like that? Nah, but these are the things. We tend to be empathetic about the things that we care for, right? And I'm really into building some great teams. And also understanding that if we truly believe in the prime directive, then maybe some of our actions need to change. Okay, and then we also can get into this higher order energy state where people are saying, but DevOps was going to save us. It was going to take us to the promised land. And now we have a distributed monolith that no one has control over, and it's worse than what we were before. And so we might be, so as we have these perspectives, what we need to be aware, concerned or aware that we don't get into this, what I call the zero-sum game, right? And in my opinion, it's not about DevOps versus Agile. Declarative end state is the same. And if we get into that religious war, we'll all end up losing. So what I would recommend is that trying different components. Some people, and this is the interesting thing, one person might perceive an implementation of how we do something as Agile, and another person may perceive the same thing as DevOps, right? And in the end, does it really matter, right? So depending on your organization, if you're sort of slanted the Agile way, then your mileage may vary. You might want to go more Agile or speak the language more Agile. If you're DevOps, you may want to go to DevOps. And we're driven by the needs of the organization and the people. And at the end of the day, for me at least, it's an acknowledgement of the people that are working in the organization. And a really interesting post that propelled me, I made it one of our guiding principles for our DevOps Days core organization team. And it was from an article that a gentleman from Finland, I think, had written, was one of those no dickhead rules. You see, those no dickhead rules or no a-hole rules or something. And he'd spoken about bringing the outside in. And it's about this perception that when we cross the door at work, all of our other lives disappear. And his comment was, so he viewed it from the other way. And he was like, well, these people have friends and significant others, and I take them away from those people for 40 hours a week. This is quite a long time relative to the hours in the week. And so what he calls by bringing the outside in is he recommends that these people come in. And he, for all his staff, I know of other people that know the names of their children, spouses, and whatnot. Just that different perception and acknowledgement that you exist with somebody else and that you know it. So one of the things that we find in organizing DevOps, the DevOps Days conference is that this is it's a volunteer effort. right? And the people that are likely to pay the most cost, because we still got to do our day jobs, are going to be the significant others that are there. And so one of the guiding principles that we've had is we really wanted to acknowledge those. And so depending on our sponsorship, because if you have a core value, a real core value, you do it even if you get punished for it. So hopefully I don't get, anyway. But, the hope is, for me, we have core contributors based both in Auckland and Wellington. But I would really like to have a lunch event and they bring their families together. Because when you're talking to someone and you actually know and you've met the other person's name and you know the person at work, just means that the other person's felt respected, right? Which sounds quite obvious and elegant, but it's kind of interesting that we haven't thought about that before. But anyway. The other thing we need to do is we need to learn to solve the problem, not the symptoms, right? And so this is really hard, but I find I get better at this. We have a phrase in the DevOps which we call a local optimization, right? And that's when you solve the symptom. The trouble with a local optimization, it's that gateway drug, right? When you have a local optimization, it solves the problem, it does it fast, and it feels really good, right? The reality of local optimizations is they just shift the burden to someone else, right? Which is really unfortunate. And then here's the irony. Sometimes that burden lands on you, and you're like, what? What's going on? But we don't remember the times when we did a local optimization and shat on somebody else's parade, right? And the other thing is about what really important to me is a concept of leadership. And so much when we talk about leadership, we said what a leader needs to do and what they need to champion, and they need to champion good behaviors, right? This article here really spoke to me because I have seen and experienced in my time aspects where there were behaviors that were in conflict and no one said anything. So if your culture, and so when I read this, I found it to be so true, right? And so when we go back to our stand-up example, right? We're like the worst behavior, it's a bit rough, but worst behavior, well, we're too deep and then we're not obeying the 3 rules. The stand-up should be 5 minutes, not 50 minutes, kind of a thing, right? Everyone should be a leader in that stand-up, right? We should all be leaders, and we should all have the ability to hold each other to account. So one of the other interesting things that I have discovered in my DevOps journey, that I hope if in your Agile journey you have discovered as well, is a concept of human systems. And it's actually quite dear to my heart. So a smart guy, again, David Edwards, he came up with the clams thing. He came up with this concept that there are actually 2 complex systems at work. A group of people together, working as a team, as a complex system, and the process in which, and the environment of which they perform. Typically what we do is they get oversimplified into one complex process. And so as we got 2 complex, it's just one, or Agile's not working for us. Agile could be fine, the problem could be with the team. So there's the people complex system and the process complex. And when I talk about process, it's the way that we develop software, it's our culture, it's our environment. And this is the aspects which we don't tend to think of as much as we should when we're trying to figure out why stuff doesn't get done, right? If you have if people are operating in a system that incentivizes for getting something done, and you go in them and tell them about you need to be more reliable with their code, they're less likely to listen to you. What needs to change is the system, right? The irony is that you'd probably behave the same way if you were in that system. So we get a simplification of failure, and we talk about cognitive bias. Now I'm loving cognitive bias. Because the great thing about cognitive bias is you can see it in other people, and other people can see it in you. So, but if they don't know about cognitive bias, they can't see your cognitive bias. So it's really, I really like that. But anyway, but one of the ones I like, fundamental attribution error. That's the one where, you walk into the supermarket and you've got your kids and they're behaving well. And then you walk around the corner and there's some dad going off at his kid, oh yeah, like this. And what do? And man, he's a bad dad. Whoa. And then we go around the other corner and your kid does something and you're like, whoa. And we're like, no, I'm not a bad dad. I just have really poor kids. Right? That is fundamental attribution. We blame the action on somebody else when they're doing it. But when it's our turn, and when we're really bad at doing it, we blame the context, right? But there are other cognitive bias that play well, especially in some of the rituals that we tend to do around learning reviews and blameless postmortems, which is hindsight bias and outcome bias. And I thought I had a slide up there. One of the interesting things I was going to ask was, anyone looking for bias? And okay, so you're going to have to help me out. What's the thing when you plan all the stories? What's that called again? Planning? Yeah, you're figuring out what you're going to put in the sprint and stuff like that? Sprint planning. So we're in sprint planning, right? I suspect there is a lot of outcome bias in sprint planning, right? Because I've been in a lot of sprints, plan looks good. Day before sprint ends, oh, it's not good. Forgot about this. And as we chase it back, well, we're just like, we thought it's just going to be the happy path. We're just going to have to code this up, and we're going to code this up, and it's going to be all good. And then we figure out, didn't count on that. So, what would be really interesting is whether that would be useful in the rituals that you have as well. So there's a couple of things there. The other thing is that with simplification, we get to this mindset that we're only ever solving technical problems. And if we have the too complex systems aspect, can tell us that we're wrong, and then everyone else will know probably that there's very little technical problems in the world. It's just the people talking to other people. Which brings me on just this little part here. So I've been reading a lot of Brené Brown. She is just unbelievably fantastic because she tells me how really poor I am, and so that's like a self-learning kind of thing going on. That's what I like. But it did remind me, so there's a concept that we treat vulnerability as a weakness, not a strength. But in fact, her proposition is that vulnerability is actually a strength, which is a fundamental requirement for courage. Right? And one of the things I did read that sounded quite interesting along that, Steve Hansen was quoted in a time when they were just about to win the World Cup. Yes, we won the World Cup. Around how the culture of the All Blacks had changed. They were doing more engagements with the community. They were speaking well. They were going here, there, and everywhere. And it wasn't that long ago where that wasn't happening. And they were asking the coach, what changed? And Steve Hansen said, good people make good All Blacks. There were like all these scary stories of what went on in the back doors of the All Blacks locker rooms and hotels. Apparently they came up with their own legal system. There was a judge, and then you had to you can just imagine the initiations, right? But if you had that kind of behaviors in people and expecting a different outcome because they are role models to a whole nation, it's like having the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And what he said is if we embrace those behaviors here, before they're an All Black, it's a lot easier and their outcomes are much better. And one of the things, I coach my son's under-9 rugby team. If you're a coach, you should try coaching kids. You'll have, the patience you learn coaching kids. I tell you, At the end of some of the end of the games, I don't do it that often, but one of the parents might bring the bag of sweets, right? Before it just used to be water when I was a kid. Now it's just like kids get lollies and stuff. And I'm like, what's with that? But there'll always be a couple of kids that say please and thank you, right? And so when I say good, I'm not saying that they're intrinsically good. What I'm saying is we have good behaviors, right? And And those, you remember those kids when they come over to your house, don't you? They go, thank you, Mr. Dunn. Yes, Mr. Dunn, take their shoes off. You remember those people, right? And so with the vulnerability, what Brene Brown, she's got a couple of TED Talks. So if you do Brene Brown and TED Talk, you'll just go watch them. They're really, really good. They're about 15 minutes each. She has worked out through her research that we have these shame profiles. And you might be wondering what the heck does this have to do with DevOps and Agile? But if we've got our two complex systems, we need to understand the complex systems of people. And the fact that what the role of vulnerability plays, because inherently what vulnerability is doing is it's protecting us from being rejected. And anyone that feels like they're going to be rejected, they're going to show some armor. They're not going to engage with their team. They're not going to trust their team. And in essence, we're not going to have good behaviors that make great teams. And so there are shame profiles for men and women, and the women are up first because ladies before gents and all that stuff. But fundamentally, the shame profiles for women is, how do I look? And am I a good mother? Right? And so that bottom line is something that I hear, that I put in there, because that's so true. But in the context of the system, there has been research done on performance reviews of women and men in technical companies. And the analysis has been alarmingly disturbing. So on the right there, so it says women and men. So that's a concept, that's a number of negative feedback, right? So the negative feedback, so total that is negative feedback. In the woman, there's like 71 out of 94, I think that does. 76% of feedback, of negative or any feedback is negative and is personal. Specific to either the way that they operate, they engage, they look, they dress, intrinsic to who they are. 76%. Only 2% in men. So there is a system at play that is slanted way against women. I had to read that twice when I saw that out. The link is down the bottom here. It's a really good article if you see. But now we have a system. Now we tie that into a shame profile where women think that they're not pretty enough, they don't look good enough, and they're not great mums. That is just unbelievably devastating. And for men, it's the imposter syndrome. Am I good enough? Am I keeping up with the Joneses next door? Anyone got a last name of Jones? Oh, there we go, trying to keep up with this young fella. Hey, woo! And then the other one is providing for the family. So some of you might not have a family, but that is something that has resonated with me as well. And so how does this relate to how we make great teams? Well, then if we look at the shame armor and we have aspects of what the shame armor has, we have perfectionism. Perfectionism is another word for your developers going dark because they do not want you to test their code because it's not perfect. And it's likely to make you sprint late. Because there is a lack of modeling of vulnerability to say, let's have a look at the code, maybe let's just work together. Right? Poor rationalization. I love this one. I have a coach that I meet he calls it supervision. I don't know why he calls it supervision. It's like I'm supervised or something like that. But he talks about this concept of poor rationalization. So we're in an argument about, I don't know, monolith and microservice. And we're in this, but there's some underlying tension behind that argument. A fact that going back that 2 years ago you called me a dickhead to this other person and I know about it and now I resent you for that. And then at some point in the conversation, we veer off. And now we're rationalizing this argument based on an emotive feeling that we had before. And if it ever happens, no one wins those arguments. Right? And the other thing is they don't get resolved, so you're likely to have them again. Oh! And the other thing that we have a lot of, especially is self-doubt. Can I do this? I don't know if I can do this. The more I know, the more I don't know. Oh my gosh, I'm a fake. They're going to find out. Kind of what I'm thinking that you guys are thinking looking at my slides, but anyway. Okay, and then we have an aspect of not fully engaged, right? And there's a lot of research, there's a lot of material around about percentages. I think there's around about 15% actively disengaged. That means they're tanking your organization and are toxic to people in your organization. And then there's about 10% fully engaged, and in the middle, they're just like, whew. Right? If you can get those people fully engaged, you can really make some really good teams. Okay, so the takeaways. Good people make great teams, and I truly believe that. If we've got a concept of two complex systems, that makes it easier to understand and easier to rationalize where we need to add our DevOps or our Agile solutions. Great teams make exceptional software. They know what part of their software is being used, and they're likely to be a reference for somebody else, right? And at the end of the day, we can't make exceptional software. What are we doing? I'm a big Jim Collins fan. You know, good is the enemy of great. Beware the zero-sum game. Let's not get into religious wars, but focus on what really matters and also embrace vulnerability. Because the embrace vulnerability is likely needed to be modeled by other people. We can't just say, hey, embrace vulnerability. You'll be all right. That's something that intrinsically has to be modeled throughout the organization. Because this is a pathway, I truly believe that this is a pathway for courage, right? And that allows us to dare greatly. There's a book by Brené Brown that I'm currently reading called Dare Greatly, but those things line up. And if you have a team that wants to embrace vulnerability to dare great and try new things and become and make exceptional software, I feel this is the prescription that we have. So in tying that all back together with the DevOps and Agile, are we friends or enemies? I don't think we are. Hopefully you feel the same way. But it's more about what the end game is and how we can typically work together to provide a better outcome and have great teams. My name is Reuben Dunn. Thank you for your time.
And realise that I totally screwed up and didn't tell you about Slido. So there's some questions on Slido, but I don't think we actually have time right now to answer them. So I just want to thank Reuben hugely. He's opened my eyes, and I've got so much more research that I want to do on my DevOps journey and our Agile and DevOps journey together. I'm really lucky because Reuben works with me, so I can go and talk to him. You guys aren't quite so lucky, but we've videoed this, so I'll get the video. We'll get the video up as quickly as we can, so then you can recap, because there was an awful lot of material in there to go and do research on. So I'll get the video up as soon as possible. So I suggest that you go outside and network and talk to Reuben. If you've got questions, there are a few questions that were quite popular on Slido, so I suggest that you go and talk to Reuben. There's also a research student who's just walking up the back, who's got some paper that he'd like to, if you can pick up a survey, is it? Yep, that would be awesome. So I hope to see you guys outside. The other thing I haven't done is tell you about the next event. So there's a deep dive in 2 weeks. So we're carrying on with the DevOps journey. I can't remember what the talk is called, but I'll get it up on, the presentation's called, but I'll get it up on Meetup tomorrow morning. Because we get quite a low turnout, or Meetup starting to cause us to have a lower turnout coming to the events, we're starting to charge $5 to our workshops, our deep dive, because it's quite a lot of organising for a few people that come. So we're carrying on with that experimentation, so there'll be a charge of $5. So being agile with infrastructure, and it's carrying on with that DevOps theme. In May, we have a talk, so I think it's just a week later after that, about building cooperative relationships. So again, carrying on with that theme about relationships and building great teams. And in June, Ian Maple, who came here a year ago, is one of those international speakers. We don't need them because we've got amazing people in Auckland already. Is coming back to give another talk. And we've also got our AGM, so there'll be some new committee members that you'll see. So look forward to meeting you all outside, and thank you very much. And thanks, Reuben, again.